My name is Christine Andler, and I am 34 years old. Last Christmas Eve, I stood on the frozen porch of my childhood home, holding a gift I knew I would never give. I arrived late to the family holiday dinner. Before I could turn the brass knob, the sound of clinking glasses stopped my hand. My father's voice carried clear and sharp through the heavy wood. "Thank God Christine decided to skip it this year." A second later, my younger sister Chloe let out a bright laugh. "Nobody wants her lecturing us tonight anyway." I stood in the freezing wind, holding my breath. But that toast was not the reason I had my attorney on speed dial. That legal retainer was paid 3 weeks earlier. I made the wire transfer the morning I discovered a $285,000 mortgage registered against a property I owned out of state. The loan documents bore my signature. A signature I never wrote. Before we get to the dinner table and the police sirens, I need you to do something. If you know what it feels like to be the family scapegoat, hit that subscribe button. Drop your age, your location, and your local time in the comments. Let me know where you are tuning in from, and welcome to Sweet Karma Life. Now let me rewind the clock to a quiet Tuesday in August. I am a cosmetic chemist. For 3 grueling years, I spent my nights in a rented lab space breathing in the smell of sterile alcohol and synthetic compounds. I skipped vacations. I drove a 10-year-old sedan. Every spare dollar funded my research. I was developing an enzymatic skincare serum. The formulation was designed to penetrate the epidermal lipid barrier without triggering an inflammatory response. I had the clinical trial data to prove it worked. I was weeks away from submitting the final paperwork to the patent office. This serum was my life raft. My sister Chloe lived a different reality. At 28, she floated through life on a cushion funded by my parents. She quit jobs the moment a manager gave her critical feedback. She complained about toxic work environments while using our father's credit card to buy designer bags. When she fought with the roommates, she treated my apartment like a free hotel. I tolerated it because setting a boundary with Chloe meant going to war with my parents. My father always demanded I keep the peace. "You are the older sister, Christine. Act like it." That Tuesday, I came home from the lab early. The apartment was silent. Chloe had gone out for afternoon drinks. I walked into my home office to drop off my bag and froze. My laptop sat in the center of the desk. The lid was shut, but the chassis was rotated slightly toward the chair. I am meticulous. I always square my devices to the edge of the mat. I sat down and tapped the spacebar. The login screen glowed in the dim room. I typed my password and immediately opened the system diagnostic logs. My heart hit a steady pounding rhythm against my ribs. 20 minutes before I walked through the front door, a guest user bypassed my sleep screen. They navigated straight to my encrypted business folder. The logs showed a mass export. My target demographic research, my 3-year clinical trial spreadsheets, and the precise raw ingredient percentages for the serum had been copied to an external flash drive. I sat in the quiet room, staring at the harsh blue light of the monitor. My own sister had rifled through my life. I did not scream. I did not pick up the phone to demand answers. I simply changed my administrative passwords, locked the computer in a fireproof safe, and went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. I thought she was just being nosy. I figured she wanted to see my financial projections to complain to our mother about how much money I was spending on a pipe dream. I assumed it was petty jealousy. I was wrong. I drastically underestimated her ambition, and I had no idea what my family was preparing to do to ensure her success. September brought a sharp drop in temperature across the Midwest. 4 weeks had passed since the incident with my laptop. I had secured my files, upgraded my encryption, and told myself Chloe had just been snooping for gossip. The reality was much sharper. I drove downtown to the Palmer House Hilton on a Thursday evening. The hotel ballroom was hosting the annual Chicago Innovators pitch deck. I was not there to present. I was months away from my official launch. I bought a general admission ticket simply to scout the landscape. I needed to see what the current seed round valuations looked like for biotech skincare startups. The room smelled of stale coffee, expensive wool suits, and nervous sweat. I found a seat in the back row near the exit doors. I wanted to observe without being noticed. The lights overhead dimmed. A spotlight hit the center stage. The master of ceremonies adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. He read from a small card. Next up, we have a founder who is redefining the barrier repair market. Please welcome the CEO of Oraglow. A woman walked out from behind the velvet curtain. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit. Her hair was styled in flawless waves. She held a clicker in her right hand. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. It was Chloe. My 28-year-old sister stepped into the center of the spotlight. This was the same woman who once called me crying because she could not figure out how to reset the breaker in her apartment. Now she stood in front of 200 angel investors, exuding the calm authority of a seasoned tech founder. I gripped the armrest of my chair. The fabric scratched against my palms. I forced myself to sit still. Chloe pressed the clicker. The massive screen behind her illuminated. The logo for Oraglow faded into the first slide. It was my executive summary. The font was different. The background color was shifted from slate gray to a soft peach. But the words were mine. I watched in a heavy silence as she advanced to the next slide. My target demographic research appeared. She rattled off the customer acquisition cost projections I had spent 6 weeks calculating. She did not miss a single beat. She moved across the stage with rehearsed precision, pointing to the graphs I built in my tiny rented lab. The true gut punch landed on slide 4. The proprietary formula. Chloe brought up the chemical breakdown of the enzymatic synthesis. She stood under the bright lights and explained the lipid barrier degradation bypass. She sounded brilliant. She sounded like a chemist. This was a girl who failed high school biology twice. Our parents had to hire a private tutor just so she could graduate. Now, she was effortlessly delivering a thesis on molecular absorption rates. I shifted my gaze from the stage to the audience. I scanned the front row, reserved for VIP guests and family members of the founders. Sitting directly in the center seats were my mother and father. My father had his phone raised, recording the entire presentation. His chest was puffed out. My mother sat beside him, clutching her purse with a look of pure adoration plastered across her face. They knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had driven 3 hours to Chicago for this event, and they never mentioned a word to me. My mother had called me twice that week to complain about her grocery bill, but omitted the fact that her youngest daughter was launching a biotech company. They were watching her pitch the theft of my life's work, and they were beaming. Chloe concluded her presentation to a wave of applause. She smiled modestly and prepared for the panel interrogation. The 3 judges sat at a long table facing the stage. The man in the center leaned forward. His name was Bradley. "Your market research is solid," he began. "But the skincare space is saturated. Everyone claims to have a miracle serum. What makes this enzymatic process different? And more importantly, how did you develop a medical-grade formulation without a background in biochemistry?" I waited for the hesitation. I waited for the facade to crack. Chloe did not even blink. She leaned into the microphone. "Necessity is the mother of invention, Bradley. I struggled with severe cystic acne for years. Every product on the market damaged my skin barrier further. So I started researching. I turned my small kitchen into a makeshift laboratory. I am self-taught, but the clinical data you see on slide 7 speaks for itself. It was a flawless performance." She spun a relatable, vulnerable narrative of the struggling consumer taking matters into her own hands. She sold them a story. Bradley nodded slowly. He looked at the data packet in front of him. He liked the hustle. He liked the profit margins I had mapped out. "I am interested," Bradley said. His voice echoed through the ballroom. I will offer you a $100,000 seed investment to fund your first manufacturing run. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My mother gasped audibly from the front row. My father lowered his phone and pumped his fist. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand, feigning overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," she breathed into the microphone. "You have no idea what this means." "There are conditions," Bradley continued, holding up a finger to silence the room. "I do not fund hobbies. I fund committed founders. If you want my firm's capital, you need to have your own skin in the game. I require $100,000 in matching funds from your end. It proves you believe in the product enough to risk your own capital. Additionally, the funds will be placed in escrow until I see the finalized pending patent for the formula. You show me the patent and the matching capital by the end of the quarter, and we close the deal." The ballroom went dead silent. $100,000 was not casual money. Chloe had zero savings. She had maxed out 2 credit cards the previous year. I looked at the back of my parents' heads. My father ran a struggling hardware store. They were drowning in consumer debt. They did not have $10,000, let alone $100,000. I expected Chloe to politely decline. I expected her to ask for a smaller stake. Instead, she stood tall, squared her shoulders, and smiled directly at Bradley. "Done," she said. Her voice rang clear with unearned confidence. "We will have the matching funds and the patent secured." Bradley smiled. "We have a deal." The applause erupted again. I did not stand up. I did not scream fraud. I did not march down the aisle to confront my family. A cold, calculating calm settled over me. I stood up from my chair at the back of the room and pushed open the heavy exit doors. I walked out of the hotel and into the freezing Chicago wind. The first piece of the puzzle had locked into place. Chloe had stolen the data. But the second piece was a massive, glaring void. Where was a chronically unemployed 28-year-old going to secure $100,000 in liquid cash to match a venture capitalist? My parents were broke. They had no assets they could leverage except their own primary residence, which was already mortgaged to the hilt. I pulled my coat tight against the wind and walked toward the parking garage. The math did not add up. The money had to come from somewhere. Someone was going to pay for my sister's ambition. I just did not know yet that the person funding her theft was going to be me. October arrived and stripped the leaves from the trees lining my street. 4 weeks had passed since the pitch competition in Chicago. I spent that month working quietly in my rented lab space, finalizing my patent application and ignoring the group chats my mother created to celebrate Chloe. I convinced myself I could survive the theft of my business plan as long as I secured the legal rights to the actual chemical formula. I assumed the worst of the damage was over. I was naive. The second blow arrived on a Tuesday afternoon disguised as mundane junk mail. I checked my metal mailbox in the lobby of my apartment building. Wedged between a grocery circular and a utility bill was a standard white envelope from a national lending institution. My name was printed on the front. I tore the paper open while waiting for the elevator. It was a generic notice regarding an escrow shortage. The letter stated there were insufficient funds to cover the upcoming property tax disbursement and requested an immediate deposit to balance the account. I stepped into the elevator and stared at the parcel number printed at the top of the page. It referenced a property in Oak Park. The address belonged to a modest 3-bedroom ranch house left to me by my late grandfather. My grandfather was a pragmatic retired mechanic. He intentionally bypassed his own son when drafting his will. Hardware store into the ground with reckless inventory purchases and poor management. He knew a paid-off asset in my parents' hands would be leveraged and lost within a year. He wanted me to have a permanent safety net. I honored his wish. I rented the house to a quiet couple and kept the property taxes current. There was no mortgage. The house was owned free and clear. A paid-off house does not have a mortgage escrow account. I unlocked my apartment door and dropped my bags on the floor. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I dialed the toll-free number printed at the bottom of the notice. An automated voice prompted me to enter the last 4 digits of my Social Security number. I typed the numbers on my keypad. The robotic voice confirmed my identity and then recited a sentence that made the room tilt. Your current principal balance is $285,000. I hung up the phone. I did not take off my coat. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to the county clerk records office. The municipal building smelled of floor wax and stale air. I pulled a paper ticket from a red dispenser and waited in a row of plastic chairs. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. When my number flashed on the digital screen, I walked up to the thick glass partition. I slid my driver's license under the slot and asked the clerk for every recent filing associated with my Oak Park parcel number. She tapped her keyboard for a few moments. The printer in the corner whirred to life. She gathered a massive stack of paper, stapled it twice, and pushed it back through the slot. 50 pages. I carried the heavy document out to the hallway and sat on a hard wooden bench. I turned to the first page. The bold black letters across the top read, Home Equity Line of Credit. The borrower was listed as Christine Andler. The origination date was September 28th. That date was exactly 14 days after Chloe stood on a stage in Chicago and promised an angel investor she possessed matching capital. I flipped past the amortization schedules, the interest rate disclosures, and the default clauses. I needed to see the final page. I needed to see the execution of the fraud. I reached the signature line. There it was. My name written in dark blue ink. The cursive loops were flawless. The slight upward slant at the end of the letter R matched my handwriting perfectly. It was an expert forgery. You cannot replicate a signature that precisely from memory. The forger needed a reference. My mind flashed to a plastic storage bin my mother kept in her attic. It contained years of my old college financial aid applications and high school permission slips. A forged signature is only half the crime. The document still required a state seal to become legally binding. I moved my eyes down to the notary public section. The circular stamp was pressed firmly into the bottom corner of the paper. I read the name inside the ring. Thomas Vance. The remaining air left my lungs. Thomas Vance was not a random bank employee who made a careless administrative error. He was the senior loan officer at a community bank 2 towns over. More importantly, he was my father's standing Saturday morning golf partner. They had played 18 holes together every weekend for 15 years. Thomas drinks scotch on our back patio every 4th of July. He knew exactly who I was. He knew I was not sitting in his office signing that paper. The entire mechanism of the betrayal laid itself bare on the wooden bench. Chloe needed $100,000 to secure the seed money from Bradley. My parents were drowning in credit card debt. They had no liquid cash and no assets left to leverage. But they knew I had a paid-off house sitting quietly in the suburbs. My father made a phone call to his golf buddy. They bypassed the standard identity verification protocols. They drafted the paperwork. My mother provided the signature. Thomas provided the stamp. They stole my grandfather's house to fund my sister's theft of my intellectual property. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit the back of my throat. I dropped the heavy stack of papers onto my lap and leaned forward, gasping for stale air in the municipal hallway. The edges of my vision blurred. I reached under the hard wooden bench and gripped the raw oak edge. I squeezed the wood so fiercely that splinters drove into my palms and a thin line of blood welled under my fingernails. I had to anchor myself to physical pain just to stop my entire body from shaking apart. The people who taught me how to ride a bicycle and packed my school lunches had systematically robbed me. They risked sending themselves to federal prison just to ensure the golden child did not look foolish in front of an investor. I sat folded over that bench for 10 agonizing minutes, letting the physiological shock run its course. Slowly, the trembling stopped. My racing pulse flattened into a dead, methodical rhythm. The betrayal was so deep, it burned right through the panic and settled into a frozen, calculated calm. A new mathematical problem hovered in my mind. The line of credit was for $285,000. Chloe only needed $100,000 to satisfy the venture capitalist. That left a massive surplus. My parents had extracted an extra $185,000 of my equity. I needed to know exactly which accounts that money flowed into. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from my mother. The message read, "Family dinner this Sunday. I am making your favorite pot roast. Please do not be late. We have some exciting news to share about your sister." I stared at the glowing words. A year ago, I would have driven straight to their house. I would have thrown the 50-page document on their kitchen table and demanded answers. I would have cried. I would have given them the opportunity to gaslight me, to minimize the damage, and to play on my ingrained sense of familial duty. But the woman who would have cried died on that wooden bench. I did not type a reply. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I rolled the forged contract into a tight cylinder. I was not going to ask my family for the truth. I was going to hire a forensic accountant to follow the wire transfers and build an inescapable cage. November brought early snow to the Midwest and an isolating, heavy quiet to my daily routine. I spent the entire month constructing a fortress of silence. I did not storm into my father's hardware store to demand answers. I did not send a rage-fueled text message to my sister. Confrontation without leverage is just an emotional tantrum, and my family was immune to my tears. They had spent decades training me to absorb their damage and apologize for the inconvenience. This time, I needed leverage heavy enough to shatter concrete. The psychological endurance test began immediately. I maintained my usual communication patterns to avoid triggering their suspicion. When my mother called on Sunday mornings to chat about neighborhood gossip, I answered the phone. I matched her pitch. I listened to her complain about the rising cost of winter tires while knowing she had just stolen $250,000 from my future. During the third week of November, I even attended our traditional family Thanksgiving dinner. I sat across the table slicing dried turkey while Chloe dominated the conversation. She complained loudly about the supply chain delays affecting her new skincare packaging. She used words like viscosity and lipid barriers with unearned confidence. My father poured her wine and toasted to her relentless work ethic. I took a sip of water, chewed my food, and smiled. It was terrifying how easy it was to mirror their deception. While they carved the turkey, I was funding a different kind of operation. I had emptied my remaining personal savings to hire Marcus, a ruthless real estate litigator who specialized in title fraud. Marcus was a man who communicated in statutes and injunctions. He did not care about toxic family dynamics. He cared about paper trails. I sat in his sterile downtown office with the floor-to-ceiling glass windows and handed him the 50-page line of credit contract. He reviewed the forged signature and traced his pen over the notary stamp. He recognized Thomas Vance's name immediately. Marcus made one phone call to an independent forensic accountant. Their instructions were simple: follow the equity, find exactly where my grandfather's house went. The forensic report took 2 excruciating weeks to compile. Marcus slid a thick black binder across his polished mahogany desk on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The wire transfers painted a masterpiece of financial desperation. The bank disbursed $285,000 on October 2nd. The funds did not go into my current primary checking account. They were routed directly into the primary business operating account for Andler Hardware. It was a calculated move by my father to bypass the anti-money laundering triggers that would have instantly frozen a massive sudden deposit into a personal account. A struggling retail store has constant cash flow fluctuations, so a large wire transfer went completely unnoticed by the automated banking algorithms. From that business account, the stolen equity splintered. $100,000 was wired cleanly into a newly registered corporate entity named Oraglow LLC. Chloe had her matching capital for the angel investor. But the remaining $185,000 told a much darker story. That money never touched my sister's hands. It was dispersed in a dozen different directions to plug the sinking ship of my parents' lives. Marcus walked me through the ledgers. $40,000 stayed in the business account to pay off a high-interest commercial loan, keeping my father's failing hardware store out of foreclosure. $80,000 vanished into 5 different maxed-out platinum credit cards. The rest settled a lingering state tax lien and caught up the delinquent payments on my mother's luxury SUV. My parents did not commit federal wire fraud simply to support my sister's entrepreneurial dreams. They used Chloe's ambition as a convenient smokescreen to bail themselves out of a decade of financial incompetence. They butchered my grandfather's legacy to pay for their country club dues and their failed retail inventory. The betrayal evolved from a stolen business plan into systemic parasitism. I drove home from the law office feeling a strange, crystalline calm. The emotional anchor tying me to my family was officially severed. I walked into the lobby of my apartment building and checked my mailbox. Sitting inside the metal cubby was a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The return address printed in the upper left corner read, United States Patent and Trademark Office. I carried the rigid envelope upstairs and sat at my kitchen table. I did not bother taking off my coat. I carefully pulled the red tear string across the top. Inside was a heavy bond certificate featuring a raised gold seal and a blue ribbon. The patent for the enzymatic barrier repair synthesis was approved. It was officially registered under my legal name. The chemical formula, the extraction method, the precise molecular stabilization process, it all belonged to me in perpetuity. I traced my fingers over the gold foil. This was 3 years of honest, grueling labor materialized into federal protection. I placed the patent on the table next to the black forensic accounting binder. The reality of the situation crystallized. Chloe had sold a prominent Chicago angel investor a percentage of a company she did not own, using a scientific formula she did not invent, backed by capital stolen from a property she had no legal right to leverage. She had built a castle on top of a legal landmine, and I was holding the only detonator. The final piece of the trap arrived the very next afternoon. It was a thick, glossy envelope with silver foil lettering addressed to me in my mother's cursive handwriting. I opened it to find a heavy cardstock invitation. You are cordially invited to celebrate the official launch of Aura Glow Skincare and the Andler family Christmas Eve dinner. The audacity was breathtaking. They were hosting a catered event to celebrate the launch of my stolen company, funded by my stolen house, and they expected me to attend? They wanted the scapegoat sitting quietly in the corner while they toasted their fraudulent success. They needed me there to maintain the illusion of the happy, supportive family unit for their new investor. I walked over to my laptop sitting on the kitchen counter. I opened the event website listed at the bottom of the card. I typed my name into the digital guest registry. I clicked the button marked Attending. I did not hire Marcus to send a quiet cease and desist letter in the mail. I did not want my parents and my sister to have the comfort of a private panic or the opportunity to shred documents. They chose a highly public stage to steal my life. I was going to use their stage to take it back. I packed the forensic binder and the gold-sealed patent into a slim leather briefcase. I had exactly 3 weeks to prepare for Christmas Eve. I stood on the frosted concrete of the front porch. The winter wind off Lake Michigan whipped fine powdered snow against the hem of my heavy wool coat. Inside the house, the golden glow of a massive crystal chandelier spilled through the decorative glass panels of the front door. This was the residence where I spent my entire childhood. It was a sprawling colonial brick home situated in a neighborhood where maintaining appearances dictated your social survival. My father dedicated his adult life to manicuring the front lawn and upgrading the exterior facade to mask the financial rot buried deep within the foundation of our family. Tonight, the facade was engineered to perfection. I watched through the window as a hired server wearing a crisp black vest walked past the glass carrying a silver tray of appetizers. They were spending the stolen equity from my grandfather's house on bacon-wrapped dates and premium imported champagne. I rested my gloved hand on the freezing brass doorknob. The thick oak wood muffled the ambient noise of the party, but my father possesses a booming theatrical voice. He always projects when he demands an audience. I heard the sharp chime of a silver spoon tapping against a glass flute. Silence fell over the crowded foyer. I leaned closer to the doorframe. To my youngest daughter, he began. His tone dripped with a manufactured swelling pride. Tonight we celebrate not just a corporate launch, but a triumph of the human spirit. Chloe has shown everyone in this room what true innovation looks like. She built Oraglow from the ground up with nothing but her own brilliant mind and the unwavering support of her family. A wave of polite applause filtered through the wood. Then came the inevitable punchline. "Thank God Christine decided to skip the dinner this year," my father added. "We do not need her dark rain cloud ruining this magnificent parade." A bright, rehearsed laugh echoed through the hall. It belonged to my sister. "Nobody wants her lecturing us tonight anyway, Dad. Let her stay locked inside her little laboratory." I did not flinch. I did not feel the familiar sharp sting of rejection that used to paralyze my chest during my early 20s. I stood in the biting wind and simply counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I turned the brass knob and pushed the heavy door open. The hinges let out a faint metallic whine. The frigid night air rushed into the sweltering entryway, disrupting the artificial warmth. I stepped onto the polished marble tiles. The laughter died instantly. It felt as if someone had severed the main power line to the building. 15 pairs of eyes snapped toward the doorway. My mother stood near the mahogany coat closet. She wore a tailored emerald velvet dress, purchased no doubt with the diverted funds from that dormant credit union account. Her practiced smile froze in place. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a pale chalk mask. She gripped her wine glass tightly. Her knuckles turned stark white against the delicate stem. "Christine," she stammered, her voice cracked, struggling to find air. "We did not think you would make it. The weather report said the roads were getting bad." I reached up and slowly unbuttoned my coat. I kept my movements deliberate and unhurried. I smiled warmly, making direct, sustained eye contact with the woman who forged my signature. "I would not miss Chloe's big night for the world, Mom." The tension in the foyer turned thick and suffocating. The hired servers immediately sensed the dangerous atmospheric shift and quietly backed away toward the dining room. My family operates on a strict unspoken code of silent compliance. Unplanned variables terrify them. My unexpected presence was a massive, unauthorized variable. My father recovered his composure first. He set his champagne flute on a side table with a sharp, aggressive clink. He marched across the marble floor, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. His jaw was locked tight. A familiar blue vein pulsed near his left temple. For as long as I could remember, his primary method of conflict resolution involved physical intimidation and isolated scolding. He reached out and clamped his heavy hand onto my right elbow. His grip dug deep into the fabric of my sweater. "Let us go into the kitchen for a moment, Christine," he hissed. His breath smelled of aged scotch and rising panic. "You are not going to ruin this evening. You are going to go out the back door before you embarrass us in front of Chloe's new business partner." I did not pull my arm away. I let him hold me there. I shifted my gaze past his broad shoulder and looked down into the sunken living room. The sprawling space was decorated with a towering Douglas fir tree, dripping in silver ornaments. Standing by the stone fireplace holding a highball glass was Bradley. He was the prominent angel investor from the Chicago pitch competition. Bradley wore a tailored charcoal suit. He looked entirely relaxed and confident. He was chatting with a local city councilman, completely oblivious to the fact that the capital funding his new venture was secured by a felony crime. He did not know my face. I was just another anonymous guest arriving late to a crowded holiday party. But I knew exactly who he was, and I knew exactly why my father was desperate to hide me behind closed doors. If I allowed him to drag me into the kitchen, my father would lock the door and spend an hour threatening me until I broke down and left through the garage. That was the old dynamic. The old Christine sought his approval and feared his temper. The new Christine held a certified federal patent and a forensic accounting binder inside her leather briefcase. I looked down at my father's large hand gripping my elbow. I traced my eyes back up to his flushed face. I did not blink. "Let go of me," I said. My voice was pitched low, but it possessed the density of a stone dropped into a quiet pond. He hesitated. He searched my expression for the familiar signs of submission. He found nothing but cold, rigid architecture. Slowly, his fingers uncurled. He dropped his arm to his side, stepping back. I promise, Dad, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. I am just here to give Chloe her present. I have been preparing it for weeks. I stepped around his stiff frame. I walked out of the foyer and descended the 2 small stairs into the living room. The crowd of guests parted slightly as I moved. I navigated the sea of expensive tailored suits and shimmering cocktail dresses until I reached the warmth of the fireplace. An empty leather armchair sat directly to the left of the stone hearth. It was positioned mere inches from where the angel investor was standing. I sat down in the armchair. I placed my slim leather briefcase onto my lap. I rested my hands flat on top of the smooth hide. Bradley glanced down at me and offered a polite, welcoming nod. I smiled back. The fire crackled loudly behind us, throwing erratic orange shadows against the painted walls. The bomb was sitting quietly in the center of the room, and the timer was ticking down to 0. The transition from the living room fireplace to the formal dining room was an orchestrated maneuver. My mother ushered the guests toward the long mahogany table with the practiced grace of a seasoned politician. She directed Bradley to the seat of honor on the right side of the head chair. Chloe, of course, took the head of the table. She was dressed in a sleek midnight blue gown, playing the role of the visionary founder to perfection. My father positioned himself at the opposite end, anchoring the room. I was relegated to the middle of the table, flanked by my aunt, who smelled of cheap gin, and a local city councilman who spent the first 10 minutes checking his phone. The aesthetic of the meal was designed to project generational wealth. The hired waitstaff served roasted duck and poured a vintage Pinot Noir into crystal glasses. Every piece of silver flatware and starched linen napkin was a physical manifestation of the stolen equity from my grandfather's house. I sat quietly cutting my food into small, precise squares. I did not initiate conversation. I simply watched the machinery of my family's deception operate at full capacity. Dinner quickly evolved into a masterclass in psychological warfare. Chloe held court. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany wood, speaking with practiced humility. She recounted the grueling late nights she spent in her kitchen, supposedly surrounded by beakers and raw active ingredients. She described the sting of failure and the triumph of finally stabilizing the volatile compounds. Her narrative was a flawless regurgitation of the private journal entries I had typed into my encrypted laptop 6 months prior. She even stole my personal anecdotes about spilling lipid solutions on the linoleum floor. My parents performed their supporting roles with chilling efficiency. My mother reached across the table to pat Chloe on the hand, offering a misty-eyed smile. She spun a fabricated tale about waking up at 3 a.m. to find her youngest daughter fast asleep at the kitchen island, a textbook resting under her cheek. My father nodded solemnly, adding rough, gravelly affirmations about the value of blue-collar work ethic. They were weaving a seamless collective illusion. Bradley absorbed every word. He sat beside Chloe, nodding in rhythm with her cadence. He was a man who traded on his ability to read people, but he was fundamentally outmatched. He was applying business logic to a dynamic that was driven by familial pathology. He viewed my parents as supportive pillars of the community. He did not know he was sitting across from architects of felony fraud. When the dessert plates were cleared, Bradley gently tapped his fork against his water glass. The low murmur of conversation around the table ceased. He stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. "I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge the remarkable young woman sitting to my left," Bradley began. His voice carried the polished resonance of a man accustomed to addressing boardrooms. In the venture capital sector, we see thousands of pitch decks every year. We see slick presentations and empty promises. But rarely do we find a founder with the grit, the raw intellect, and the sheer determination that Chloe possesses. Chloe lowered her eyes, offering a textbook display of modest grace. Oraglow is not just a skincare line, Bradley continued. It is a testament to what happens when brilliant innovation meets genuine support. And that support is why we are all sitting here tonight. I require my founders to have skin in the game. I require them to prove they believe in their own vision. Chloe did exactly that. With the $100,000 matching funds her wonderful parents provided to secure my seed round, we have officially secured the manufacturing facility. We begin the finalized prototype runs next week. A chorus of polite applause drifted across the table. My father leaned back in his chair, inflating his chest. He let the applause wash over him before raising his own glass. His eyes cut through the candlelight and locked directly onto mine. The mask of the genial host slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, calculating patriarch beneath. "We believe in family," my father said. His voice was loud enough to command the room, but the words were aimed entirely at me. Family is the foundation of success. When one of us has a dream, we all sacrifice to make it a reality. We do not hide in the shadows. We do not count pennies. Family supports each other's dreams at all costs. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to understand that my absence from their financial ecosystem was a moral failure. He was using the stolen money to buy praise from a millionaire and using that praise as a weapon against the daughter he had robbed. It was a layered, intricate cruelty. The guests nodded in agreement, raising their glasses to toast the sentiment. I did not pick up my wine glass. I reached for my water goblet instead. The condensation felt cool against my fingertips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch. I set the glass back onto the linen tablecloth. The heavy crystal base made a soft, hollow thud. "That is a beautiful sentiment, Dad," I said. My voice was smooth, lacking any trace of the tremor he expected to hear. I pitched my words perfectly so they carried down the length of the table without sounding strained. Family support is truly everything. The table went dead silent. The city councilman beside me stopped chewing. My mother's smile became rigid. My father's eyes narrowed. They knew I was not prone to public displays of affection. They recognized the tonal shift. I turned my head slowly, shifting my focus away from my father and directing it entirely onto my sister. "But Chloe, I have a quick question about the manufacturing process," I said. "Since you are beginning the finalized prototype runs next week, I am sure you have ironed out the stabilization protocols." Chloe blinked. A microscopic flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She offered a tight, strained smile. "Of course," she said. "Everything is fully operational." "Excellent," I replied. I leaned forward, resting my forearms against the table edge, mirroring the exact posture she had used while telling her fake stories. "So how exactly are you bypassing the lipid barrier degradation in step 4 of the enzymatic synthesis? When scaling up the centrifuge rotation, the kinetic friction inevitably destabilizes the core proteins. How did you solve the thermal shear?" The air in the dining room evaporated. The question was a dense block of high-level cosmetic chemistry. It was the exact hurdle that had kept me locked in my rented lab for 7 consecutive months. It was the problem I solved on page 42 of my patent application. It was a problem Chloe did not even know existed. Because she only stole the executive summary and the final ingredient list. She did not steal the actual manufacturing methodology. Chloe's face went completely blank. The flushed color in her cheeks drained away, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She closed it, swallowed hard, and opened it again. She looked like a fish pulled from the water, grasping for oxygen that was not there. She shot a panicked, desperate look toward our mother. My mother gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles bone white. My father shifted his weight, preparing to intervene, preparing to shut me down with a loud reprimand. But Bradley was sitting right there. The investor was watching his brilliant, self-taught founder. Bradley tilted his head, genuinely interested in the answer to my question. "Well, Chloe, Bradley prompted, his tone light but curious. How did you solve the thermal shear? Chloe gripped her napkin. A bead of sweat formed at her hairline. Well, the machinery resourcing is highly specialized, she stammered. Her voice had lost all its previous authority. It was thin and reedy. The thermal process is something we are keeping tightly under wraps. That is proprietary. I watched her squirm under the weight of her own stolen ambition. I let her hang in the silence for exactly 3 seconds. I picked up my water glass once more. It is proprietary, I agreed, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. But not to you. The silence hung in the room, heavy and fragile like spun glass. Chloe stared at me, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The confident visionary founder mask had dissolved, revealing the terrified underachiever hiding beneath. I did not break eye contact with her. Instead, I reached down to the floor beside my dining chair. My fingers brushed the smooth grain of the leather briefcase I had carried through the freezing wind. I unclasped the brass latch. The metallic click echoed sharply against the quiet backdrop of the formal dinner. I retrieved a slender, dark navy portfolio. I did not throw it. I did not slam it down in a fit of rage. I placed it flat on the mahogany table and pushed it forward. It glided effortlessly across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from Bradley. The investor looked down at the unmarked cover, then up at me, his brows furrowed. The relaxed posture of a seasoned venture capitalist gave way to genuine confusion. He was a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and he suddenly realized he was missing a critical variable. Bradley, I said, my tone shifting from the sharp inquiry I directed at my sister to a polite professional cadence. It is a pleasure to formally introduce myself. My name is Christine Andler. I am the actual chemist. My father erupted. The veneer of the gracious host shattered instantly. He slammed both of his large hands flat onto the table. The impact rattled the crystal wine glasses and sloshed expensive vintage Pinot Noir onto the pristine white linen. He pushed himself upright, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Christine, enough!" he barked. His voice was a booming weapon he had used for 3 decades to enforce compliance within our household. Whenever I scored higher on a standard aptitude test than Chloe, or won an academic award she failed to qualify for, he would use that exact tone to accuse me of showing off. "You are acting jealous of your sister, as always. You walk into her home on her night and pull a stunt like this. Apologize to Mr. Bradley right now and get out of my house." I did not flinch. I did not even look at him. I kept my gaze fastened squarely on the investor. The days of cowering under my father's volume were over. Noise is just wind when you hold the structural blueprints. "Open the portfolio, Bradley," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through my father's escalating reprimands. Bradley hesitated for a fraction of a second. His instincts warred between the social awkwardness of a domestic dispute and the ingrained self-preservation of a financial steward. The businessman won. He reached out and flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. Inside rested the official certificate from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The raised gold foil seal caught the flickering ambient light of the dining room chandelier. The blue ribbon lay flat beneath the certified text. Bradley leaned in, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, the detailed molecular diagrams, and the official registration dates. He was reading the culmination of my 3 grueling years, isolated in a rented laboratory. He was reading the late nights, the failed prototypes, and the eventual breakthrough. He was reading the truth. The city councilman sitting to my right slowly pushed his chair back away from the table. He wanted no part of the blast radius. My aunt, who had been drinking gin since 4 in the afternoon, sat with her mouth slightly open, staring at the gold seal on the patent. The carefully curated image of the successful supportive family unit was burning to the ground in front of an audience. I felt an intoxicating rush of adrenaline course through my veins. For 34 years, I had swallowed my pride to keep their fragile ecosystem intact. Tonight, I was the apex predator. As you can clearly see by the federal registration. I continued speaking with measured authority over the sound of my father demanding the hired waitstaff remove me. That specific enzymatic synthesis was patented by me. The filing occurred months before your pitch competition in Chicago. Every slide in the OraGlow presentation deck, every target demographic chart, and every clinical trial metric was stolen directly from my private encrypted computer system. Bradley stopped reading. The healthy, relaxed color drained out of his face, leaving behind a stark gray pallor. He understood the gravity of the paperwork sitting on top of his dinner napkin. He was not just looking at a petty sibling rivalry. He was looking at an existential threat to his firm. Venture capitalists pride themselves on rigorous due diligence. Funding stolen intellectual property is the kind of professional negligence that ends careers and triggers devastating shareholder lawsuits. If your manufacturing partners produce a single ounce of that product I stated, leaning back into my chair and folding my hands calmly in my lap, if you disperse another dime to that corporate entity, my legal team will sue you, your venture capital firm, and OraGlow LLC into oblivion. We will file for immediate federal injunctions, and we will make the intellectual property theft public. Your name will be permanently tied to corporate espionage. Bradley slowly closed the portfolio. He did not look at me. He turned his head and stared at the woman sitting frozen at the head of the table. Chloe was hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved and she gripped the edge of the mahogany wood so hard her knuckles looked like polished marble. Chloe, Bradley demanded. The polite, mentoring warmth was entirely gone from his voice. It dropped an octave, transforming into a cold, dangerous whisper. Is this true? Did you pitch me stolen IP? Before my sister could formulate a lie to save herself, my mother intervened. She relied on the only tactic she knew. She burst into sudden theatrical tears, her hands fluttering in the air like a wounded bird. Bradley, please, it is just a terrible misunderstanding, she cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. She stood up, reaching toward the investor, as if she could physically block him from seeing the truth. They are sisters. Sisters share things all the time. Christine is just being difficult about the paperwork because she feels left out. We can work this out internally as a family. There is no need for lawyers or threats. She gave her sister permission to use the research. It was a breathtaking display of gaslighting. She was attempting to rebrand felony theft as a simple miscommunication over borrowed clothes. She honestly believed her tears could wash away federal patent law. She thought the mandate to keep the peace would force me into silent compliance one last time. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, watching her desperately try to protect the golden child while actively throwing me under the bus. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. We do share, Mom, I said smoothly, letting the words hang in the tense air. But we do not share mortgages. The dining room fractured into a dozen different panicked frequencies. My mother let out a sharp gasp, pressing her palm against her chest. The city councilman beside me dropped his silver fork. It clattered loudly against his porcelain plate, ringing like a tiny alarm bell. I remained anchored in my seat. I felt the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart against my ribs. I had spent months anticipating this exact fraction of a second. I had played the scenario in my mind while driving to the lab, while pacing the aisles of the grocery store, while staring at the ceiling in the dark. The reality was far more satisfying than the rehearsal. What do you mean, mortgages? My father demanded. His voice dropped the booming theatrical projection and turned into a guttural defensive bark. A dangerous flush of crimson crept up his neck and flooded his cheeks. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. He thought he could still control the narrative. He believed his sheer physical presence could force me to back down. He was operating under the outdated assumption that I still feared his temper. I did not answer him with words. I reached down to the floor one more time. I pulled the second item from my leather briefcase. It was a thick manila folder bulging with 50 pages of high-density legal paper. I lifted it above the table and let it drop directly on top of the sleek patent portfolio. The heavy stack of documents landed with a dull, definitive thud that vibrated through the mahogany wood. The $100,000 you wired into Oraglow LLC last month did not come from your personal savings, Dad, I stated. My voice was calm, methodical, and devoid of any emotional waver. It was the tone of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. It came from the $285,000 home equity line of credit you and Mom fraudulently executed against Grandpa's house in Oak Park. The property that is legally deeded solely in my name. Bradley physically pushed his chair backward. The wooden leg scraped harshly across the hardwood floor. He stood up, backing away from the table as if the linen tablecloth had suddenly caught fire. The seasoned venture capitalist was no longer looking at a promising startup founder or her supportive family. He was looking at a toxic hazard that threatened his entire career. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, distancing himself from the paperwork. "Wire fraud," Bradley whispered. His eyes darted between the big stack of papers and my father. The polite, sophisticated veneer dissolved into pure corporate terror. "You funded my seed round with felony wire fraud. Do you have any idea what you have done? The Securities and Exchange Commission will dismantle my firm if we are tied to stolen capital." He turned his horrified gaze toward my sister. Chloe was sitting frozen in the head chair. The midnight blue fabric of her designer gown suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Bradley took another step back, shaking his head. "You presented me with matching funds and swore the capital was clean, Chloe. You signed legal affidavits guaranteeing the origin of that money." The moment the investor aimed his anger at her, the golden child illusion shattered entirely. Chloe did not attempt to defend her parents. She did not attempt to absorb the blame or mitigate the damage. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she immediately turned on the people who had risked federal prison to fund her dream. "I did not know!" Chloe shrieked, her voice pitched upward into a hysterical sob. She threw her hands up, pointing frantically at my mother and father. "I swear, Bradley, I had no idea where the money came from. They told me they took out a business loan. They told me they wanted to invest in my future. I did not know they forged Christine's signature. I am a victim here too." My mother let out a strangled cry. The sound was visceral and deeply pathetic. She reached a shaking hand toward the head of the table. "Chloe, please do not say that," my mother pleaded, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "We did this for you. We just wanted you to have a fair chance. We wanted you to be a success." "Do not touch me," Chloe snapped, recoiling from our mother's outstretched hand. "You ruined my company. You ruined my life." I watched the family unit devour itself. This was the peace they had always demanded I keep. A peace built on a foundation of lies, resentment, and conditional love. The moment the consequences arrived, the loyalty they preached vanished into thin air. They were strangers, fighting over a sinking lifeboat. My father could not process the insubordination. His youngest daughter was screaming at him, his investor was threatening him, and his eldest daughter was sitting quietly, watching his empire burn. He resorted to his final default setting: brute force. "Give me those papers," he roared. He lunged across the wide table. He knocked over his crystal wine glass, sending a dark red stain spreading rapidly across the white linen. He reached his massive arms toward the center of the table, aiming to snatch the manila folder and the patent portfolio. He thought if he could physically destroy the documents in front of him, he could somehow erase the reality of the situation. I moved faster. I slid both folders backward, pulling them out of his reach. He grasped empty air, his chest heaving as he stared at me across the stained tablecloth. "Do not bother," I said, my voice chilling the heated air between us. "Those are just courtesy copies, Dad. The certified originals have been locked inside my attorney's secure vault for 3 weeks." He stood, frozen, his arms still extended across the table. His jaw tightened, but the fire in his eyes began to flicker and die, replaced by the cold, dawning realization of his own vulnerability. And just so we are entirely clear, I continued leaning slightly forward to ensure every word landed with maximum impact. I know you did not forge my signature just to help your favorite daughter play pretend in the business world. I know exactly where the other $185,000 went. The forensic accounting report is already finalized. I have the wire transfer receipts tracking my stolen equity to your delinquent commercial loan, your maxed out platinum credit cards, and the late payments on Mom's luxury vehicle. The fight drained out of him. His shoulders slumped forward. The booming patriarch was gone, leaving behind a desperate aging man, drowning in debt and legal peril. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The hired waitstaff had completely abandoned the dining room, leaving us isolated in the wreckage of the holiday dinner. The trap had snapped shut, breaking every bone in the predator's leg. But I was not finished. The financial ruin was only the prerequisite for the final layer of consequences. My mother collapsed. It was not a figurative surrender or a graceful descent. Her knees buckled beneath the emerald velvet fabric of her gown, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, hollow impact that vibrated through the floorboards. She scrambled forward, abandoning every ounce of the curated social dignity she had spent a lifetime cultivating. Her hands reached out, grasping my right wrist. Her fingers felt clammy, trembling violently against my skin. The expensive diamond ring she wore pressed sharply into my flesh. "Christine, please!" she wept. The sound was ragged, tearing from her throat in a display of raw panic. "We will pay you back. I swear to you upon my life. We will pay every single cent back." "It was just a temporary loan. A bridge to get your sister started in the industry. Do not ruin our lives over money. We are your family." I looked down at the woman who had brushed my hair before grade school and taught me how to tie my shoes. For a fraction of a second, a ghost of the old guilt flickered in my chest. It was the programmed response of a child conditioned for decades to absorb the pain of her parents. But the phantom guilt vanished rapidly, replaced by the cold, hard architecture of the forged line of credit. I felt nothing but a clinical detachment. She was not crying out of remorse for stealing my grandfather's legacy. She was crying because she had finally been caught. I smoothly pulled my arm backward, breaking her frantic grip. I adjusted my sweater sleeve deliberately, creating physical space between us. "A temporary loan requires the consent of the lender, Mom," I said. My voice was quiet, carrying the density of solid lead. "You did not ask for my help. You bypassed me entirely. You stole my equity to fund a theft. You stopped being my family the moment you pressed a pen to that contract and forged my signature to steal my future." She slumped forward, weeping into her open hands. The sight of his wife weeping on the floor triggered a final desperate surge of adrenaline in my father. He could not protect his assets. He could not protect his favorite daughter's fraudulent company. But he could still try to manipulate the power dynamic. He straightened his spine, puffing out his chest and jutting his chin forward. He grasped for the familiar script of intimidation that had served him for 30 years. "You will not do it," he sneered. His tone dripped with a manufactured bravado, attempting to mask the terror leaking from his wide eyes. "You sit there acting like some corporate executioner, but I know you. You do not have the stomach for this. If you go to the cops, you send your own mother to federal prison. You send me to prison. You will not pull the trigger, Christine. You lack the guts." The dining room held its collective breath. The city councilman stood frozen near the arched doorway, having abandoned his attempt to sneak out the back hall. Bradley remained pinned against the wall, watching the patriarch place a final wager on his oldest daughter's inherent weakness. Chloe simply stared at the spilled red wine soaking into the tablecloth, her lips parted in silent shock. I did not raise my voice to meet his challenge. I did not argue. I calmly turned my left wrist and glanced at the face of my watch. The silver hand pointed precisely to 8:45 in the evening. "You are operating under an outdated assumption, Dad," I replied. I shifted my gaze back to his flushed face. "You think this dinner is a negotiation. You think I came here tonight to issue a warning or demand a tearful apology." I picked up the thick manila folder and slid it back inside my leather briefcase, pushing the brass lock down with a sharp, definitive click. "I did not come here to warn you," I stated. "I came here to watch." My father blinked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The bravado faltered, cracking under the weight of my calm certainty. "Watch what?" he asked, his voice losing its booming resonance. "The timeline," I replied, my words slicing through the suffocating silence. I bypassed the local precinct entirely. I filed the criminal reports for identity theft, bank fraud, and corporate espionage with the State Bureau of Investigation 14 days ago. Normally, white-collar cases take months to build, but the Financial Crimes Unit paid a quiet visit to your golf buddy Thomas Vance yesterday morning. My mother stopped crying. She lifted her head, her mascara streaked across her pale cheeks in dark, jagged lines. "Thomas is not as brave as you, Dad." I continued leaning back in my chair. The moment they mentioned federal prison time for notary fraud, he panicked. He flipped on you instantly. He handed over his logbook, his emails, and a recorded confession detailing exactly how you orchestrated the forgery. Because you were actively funneling the stolen equity into a newly formed corporate shell, they flagged you as a severe asset dissipation risk. That gave the prosecutor enough leverage to fast-track an emergency arrest warrant. They are securing Thomas at his home right now, and they are sending the primary unit here. The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. My father's mouth fell open. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords refused to produce sound. The illusion of his control evaporated instantly, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He looked toward the front windows, his eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing fear. He finally understood the magnitude of the trap. There was no negotiation. There was no secret family meeting to sweep the crime under the rug. The machinery of the justice system was already in motion, and he could not scream loudly enough to stop it. Right on cue, the ambient noise of the winter night shifted. The low, heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel driveway pierced the quiet. It was not a single vehicle. It was the distinct, synchronized sound of multiple heavy sedans pulling up to the curb directly outside the front lawn. Nobody moved. The hired servers remained frozen in the kitchen hallway, gripping their silver trays. Bradley pressed his shoulders flat against the painted plaster, holding his breath. Chloe buried her face in her hands, rocking back and forth in her chair, emitting a low, whining sound. Then the light hit. Sharp, piercing flashes of crimson and sapphire cut through the darkness outside. The police light bars rotated, casting erratic shadows across the elegant dining room walls. The alternating colors washed over the crystal chandelier, the roasted duck, and the ruined table setting. The opulent environment transformed instantly into a crime scene. Heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden planks of the front porch. A sharp, authoritative knock struck the heavy oak door. It was not the polite tap of a holiday guest arriving with gifts. It was the heavy, demanded entry of law enforcement executing a felony warrant. I sat quietly in my chair, resting my hands on my leather briefcase. The golden child illusion, the manufactured wealth, the decades of psychological gaslighting, it was all dead. The reckoning had arrived, and I did not have to lift a single finger to deliver the final blow. I simply removed the safety net and let gravity do the rest. The heavy oak door swung wide open, admitting 3 uniformed officers into the foyer. The cold wind rushed in behind them, carrying the metallic scent of falling snow. The lead detective did not ask for permission to enter. He stepped onto the marble tile, his boots leaving wet, dark tracks across the pristine floor. He held a folded white paper in his gloved hand. He read the warrant aloud, his voice a flat mechanical drone that offered no room for argument or negotiation. My father stood frozen in the dining room. The booming patriarch who had commanded every holiday dinner for 3 decades was reduced to a silent, trembling spectator in his own home. An officer stepped forward, requesting him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the steel cuffs locking into place echoed through the quiet room. It was the sound of a 30-year reign of manipulation coming to an abrupt, unceremonious end. My mother did not fight. The remaining energy had drained from her body. She walked toward the front door, her emerald velvet dress dragging across the wet slush tracked onto the foyer floor. The officers escorted them down the front steps. The rotating blue and red lights painted the snow-covered lawn in harsh, erratic strokes. I stood in the doorway, watching the 2 police cruisers back out of the driveway and disappear down the dark suburban street. I closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the freezing wind. The house was entirely silent. The legal machinery moved with ruthless efficiency over the next 60 days. Marcus proved why he commanded his exorbitant hourly rate. The state pursued multiple felony indictments for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Faced with the overwhelming physical evidence, the digital logs, and the cooperating testimony of the notary public, my parents had no viable defense. Their high-priced defense attorneys demanded massive upfront retainers just to negotiate a plea deal. To satisfy the legal fees and the court order restitution to the bank, my parents were forced into immediate asset liquidation. The sprawling brick colonial home where I grew up was placed on the market and sold at a deep discount. But the true casualty was the family business. Andler Hardware had anchored Main Street for 30 years. It was the physical manifestation of my father's ego. I drove past the storefront on a Tuesday afternoon and watched a liquidation crew hauling out rusted tools and dusty inventory. The massive painted sign above the door was unbolted and lowered to the sidewalk. They filed for bankruptcy the following week. The stolen equity was returned to my grandfather's property, clearing the fraudulent lien from my name forever. Chloe faced her own distinct brand of ruin. The morning after the Christmas Eve dinner, Origlow LLC ceased to exist. Bradley instructed his legal department to freeze the escrow accounts immediately. He did not simply pull his seed funding. He filed a devastating civil lawsuit against my sister for defrauding an investor and breaching her fiduciary duties. Without our parents to function as her financial safety net, Chloe was forced to navigate the consequences of her ambition alone. She could not afford corporate counsel. She moved out of her expensive downtown apartment and rented a small room in a neighboring suburb. The golden child who had never held a job for longer than 6 months was suddenly facing a mountain of legal debt and a permanently ruined professional reputation. The tech startup community in Chicago is a small, interconnected ecosystem. Word travels fast. No legitimate firm would ever take a meeting with a founder tied to stolen intellectual property. Her career ended before it even began. I expected to return to my quiet rented lab and spend the next year slowly securing small business loans to fund my own launch. I was prepared for the long, grueling climb. But the timeline shifted on the second Tuesday of January. My phone rang. The caller ID displayed a downtown Chicago area code. I answered the call. It was Bradley. The venture capitalist did not sound angry. He sounded pragmatic. He requested a brief meeting at a coffee shop near his firm. I met him the next morning carrying my original patent portfolio. Bradley did not offer me a massive term sheet or a fairy tale ending. He was a man who had just narrowly avoided a federal fraud scandal. He bought me a black coffee and looked me dead in the eye. "I do not invest in family drama, Christine," he said, his voice flat and transactional. "But I do recognize a brilliant stabilization protocol when I see one. You kept your head in a room full of chaos. That is a rare founder trait. I am not offering you a seed round today, but I will offer you a $25,000 micro grant and access to our secondary incubator lab for 6 months. You prove to me you can scale the enzymatic synthesis without compromising the lipid barrier, and we will discuss a real valuation next year." It was not a golden ticket. It was a grueling probationary test. I took it without hesitation. I spent the next year working harder than I ever had in my life. I slept on a cot in the incubator space. I sourced my own raw materials. I built the supply chain from the ground up, relying on actual clinical data instead of fabricated marketing stories. There were no shortcuts, but every late night and every exhausted morning belonged entirely to me. I possessed a pristine capitalization table free of stolen equity and toxic familial ties. It has been exactly 14 months since I walked out of that dining room and left my parents to the flashing lights of the police cruisers. Today, I am sitting at my desk reviewing the final signed paperwork for my official Series A funding round. We are officially moving into our first commercial manufacturing facility next week. The bank cleared the fraudulent lien from my grandfather's house, and my parents are currently serving the remainder of their federal sentences. Chloe is working a minimum wage retail job, permanently exiled from the tech industry. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood is gone. The mandate to keep the peace no longer controls my decisions. I realize that the people demanding your silence are usually the ones benefiting from the noise. Sometimes the individuals assigned to protect your future are the exact ones attempting to harvest it for their own gain. You cannot build a stable house on a foundation of forced loyalty. You cannot heal by setting yourself on fire to keep manipulative people warm. Peace does not arrive by keeping their secrets. True, lasting peace comes from walking out the front door and letting them burn in the fires they lit themselves. The silence in my personal life is no longer a heavy burden. It is the brilliant echoing sound of undeniable peace. I occasionally look at old photographs, but I do not miss the people in them. I miss the illusion of who I thought they were. Surviving the betrayal taught me how to rebuild my foundation from scratch. For anyone listening who feels trapped by the suffocating weight of a toxic household, I want to leave you with the 5 concrete lessons I pulled from the wreckage. Lesson 1. Blood is a biological fact, but loyalty is a daily choice. We are systematically brainwashed to believe that sharing genetics requires infinite forgiveness. It does not. If a stranger stole $250,000 from you and stole your intellectual property, you would press charges without hesitation. Family should be held to a higher standard of basic human decency, not a lower one. Lesson 2. Keeping the peace is just a manipulative code word for absorbing the abuse. Whenever my father demanded I keep the peace, what he actually meant was that my silence was required to maintain his comfort. The moment you stop setting yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm, they will accuse you of holding the matches. Let them. Lesson 3. Emotion always loses to documentation. Narcissists thrive in the muddy waters of gaslighting, denial, and revisionist history. You cannot out-yell them. You cannot make them feel genuine remorse. The only weapon that shatters their reality is irrefutable proof. Stop trying to win the argument and start gathering your receipts. Paper trails, contracts, and forensic accounting do not care about hurt feelings. Lesson 4. Shielding people from consequences guarantees their next victim will be you. My parents spent 30 years cushioning my sister's failures. That habitual rescue mission escalated into federal wire fraud. Letting them face the brutal legal reality of their actions was the healthiest boundary I ever established. You cannot cure a parasite by feeding it more of your energy. Lesson 5. Walking away is a triumph, not a tragedy. Society pushes the narrative that family reconciliation is the ultimate goal. But some bridges are constructed with rotten wood, and the only safe option is to let them collapse. The initial guilt of walking away fades rapidly, but the profound freedom of a clean break lasts a lifetime. I built my empire on the exact scientific formula they attempted to steal. But my greatest achievement was reclaiming my own autonomy. You hold the pen to your own life. You can write them out of the story whenever you are ready. Thank you for sharing your time with me here on Sweet Karma Life. If you have survived a similar ordeal, or if these lessons gave you the clarity you needed, drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Please hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs the strength to walk away, and remember, the ultimate revenge is simply a peaceful life. I will see you in the next episode.